BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone is well. On Fridays this year, I've been doing a regular segment about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. Last week on Cooper Friday, I was talking to you about the suspect, Robert Rackstraw, who is the suspect of Tom Colbert and the Casebreakers, and the subject of the book The Last Master Outlaw. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about a crime that Robert Rackstraw was accused of, and that was the murder of his own father, Philip Rackstraw. Now, if you haven't heard last week's episode, that's fine. These things are going to be going hand in hand, but it is somewhat of a follow-up. Now, Robert Rackstraw is a different type of D.B. Cooper suspect because he was indeed a career criminal, almost a lifelong criminal, but he was also extremely young at the time of the Cooper skyjacking. D.B. Cooper committed the skyjacking in 1971 on Thanksgiving Eve, when Robert Rackstraw would have been 28 years old. And D.B. Cooper boarded a plane, and he claimed that he had a bomb. He gave notes to a flight attendant with his instructions and demands, and ultimately he held everyone on the plane hostage, while he demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes, which he successfully obtained, and then he parachuted into the night, never to be seen or heard from again, although some people believe that D.B. Cooper did indeed make contact with the world through a series of letters, which I'll talk about in just a second. But that was in 1971. In 1978, there is the Philip Rackstraw murder, and some people to this day believe that Robert Rackstraw was responsible for the murder of his stepfather. And to help us out, I'm going to go over to an article from the Stockton Record. And this is available at recordnet.com, just citing the source. And this is going to provide a very basic introduction. The local ties. D.B. Cooper's jaw-dropping skyjacking made international headlines, and more headlines when D.B. Cooper mailed newspapers 4 taunting letters. 2 were mailed from Oakdale and Sacramento, both fairly near to Valley Springs, where Robert Rackstraw had connections. Now, I think that we need to preface this by saying that those are alleged communications, because there are people out there who believe that D.B. Cooper didn't even survive the skyjacking. In fact, a lot of the mainstream sources that you'll find, a lot of the mainstream commentaries that you'll find will just simply state that they don't think that D.B. Cooper could have survived the skyjacking, but the majority of people who are D.B. Cooper sleuths, I think, believe that he did indeed survive the skyjacking, and the prime suspects that are discussed are ones that were living well after D.B. Cooper's daring jump on Thanksgiving Eve, 1971. Robert Rackstraw moved to Valley Springs in 1972. He visited his sister Linda Lee in Stockton. He haunted Stockton bars. Yes, it does say that. When I read that for the first time, I was like, he haunted Stockton bars. I mean, he's not a ghost, not quite yet. He also kited checks to the tune of $75,000. Stockton police issued a warrant for him. Around this time, Rackstraw's mother died of natural causes. Rackstraw's stepdad mysteriously disappeared as well. To avoid arrest, Rackstraw blew town. He fled to Iran, where he trained Iranian helicopter pilots for the Shah. Iran had no extradition treaty with America. Cops served a warrant on Rackstraw's Stockton storage unit. Inside they found 14 rifles and 150 pounds of dynamite, enough to level a city block. And the dynamite is important because when D.B. Cooper was on the plane, he did have a briefcase which he claimed contained a bomb, and he opened the briefcase, and it appeared that the bomb was put together with some type of red dynamite or something similar to red dynamite. And one thing that gets discussed a lot in these D.B. Cooper discussions that I've been seeing since I started Cooper Friday was that some people believe that the bomb was a dud. They think that it was fake because dynamite, contrary to what we see in cartoons, is not normally red. Sometimes it is orange. In fact, orange would be the more frequently used color for sticks of dynamite. Yellow dynamite also existed. And I remember when I saw that on the television for the first time, like looking at live action things on the screen, there was yellow dynamite, and I was just thinking, that's so weird because the cartoons always portray it as red. They always display red dynamite. But, cartoons versus real life. So some people think that D.B. Cooper's bomb was totally fake, it was a dud, and he actually made it out of road flares, because road flares would have a more traditionally brighter color red. Those are just possibilities. But I was on Ross DeRacy's channel, Planet X Filmworks, and I was listening to an interview with Ryan Burns, and he was talking about the D.B. Cooper suspect Milton Fordahl, but he did say that through his research, he has encountered that red dynamite did indeed exist. It's not something only in cartoons. There was dynamite that was made that had a brighter color red, so it's entirely possible that D.B. Cooper was using real dynamite. And I don't even think that it matters too much. Was D.B. Cooper's bomb a dud? Was it real? I think that D.B. Cooper knew what he was doing. And that's what's so much more revealing about D.B. Cooper, is that he seemed to understand the chain of command. He seemed to understand that people would comply with his requests. He seemed to understand that if he were to do things a certain way on an airplane, that people would go along with stuff. And this just goes back to something that I've said from the very beginning of Cooper Friday, and that is, I think D.B. Cooper had an intense familiarity with planes, aviation, aviation procedures, everything, airports, security, all of this stuff. And I don't think that he was a layperson who just decided to plan this thing out. I think that he had some intense inside familiarity, and somebody like Robert Rackstraw would have that, because Robert Rackstraw was a pilot in the military, and he was somebody who was also a real life criminal, someone who just had this criminal edge that people described that just didn't seem to go away, and it didn't seem to soften in any particular way. But the whole point is, that's just what I thought about when I first read this thing about dynamite. And back to the article from RecordNet.com. The plot thickened when Calaveras deputies dug up the body of Robert Rackstraw's stepdad. The old man had been shot in the head and buried in a shallow grave. Rackstraw stood to inherit the property, Colbert says. Back in Iran, Bell fired Rackstraw. Iran put him on a plane to America. The FBI was waiting for him, and G-men brought him back in handcuffs. Also in a wheelchair, Rackstraw claimed his back had gone out. Authorities suspected that he was faking in hopes of being admitted to a hospital to make an easier escape. In March of 1978, Rackstraw was tried for the murder of his stepdad in Calaveras County Judicial Court. He hired a top-notch attorney. He tooted his patriotic, heroic war record, adding flamboyant exaggerations. He said that he loved his dear old stepdad, but he said the old man had enemies. A jury acquitted him. Next came his Stockton case. Owing to lesser charges, Rackstraw made bail and he bailed. That's what it says. It's an awkward sentence. Rackstraw made bail and he bailed. Renting an airplane at Stockton's airport, he flew over Monterey Bay and radioed a mayday. There was smoke in the cockpit, and he was going down, and Rackstraw vanished. Searchers found no record. Authorities were skeptical. They suspected the slippery Rackstraw had escaped again. And I think, though, that doesn't say anything about his guilt in the murder of Philip Rackstraw, because what I think that shows more is that he was just a career criminal and con man, because double jeopardy exists. I mean, it's not like he could be tried again for the murder of Philip Rackstraw. If he was acquitted by a jury once, he cannot be tried for the same crime twice. Now, that does not mean that he would have been able to evade charges of perjury or similar offenses of that nature, civil violations such as perjury, but that's hardly on par with murder. And there's actually an article over on the Cinemaholic called "Did Bob Rackstraw Kill His Stepfather, Philip Rackstraw?" And I will be reading that one here. This is by Diksha Sundraval, just citing the source. Netflix released a documentary called D.B. Cooper, Where Are You?, about the decades-long investigation into the case of D.B. Cooper. There hasn't been a solve yet, but there are a number of suspects who have looked good for the part. Bob Rackstraw is one of those few. In the docuseries, investigative journalist Tom Colbert puts forward his case of convincing everyone that Rackstraw is in fact D.B. Cooper. We get a peek into Colbert's investigation, which stretched for the span of 10 years, and discover a lot of startling things about Rackstraw. While the jury is still out on Rackstraw's connection to the infamous skyjacker, there are a number of other things that portray him as a negative character, especially during the 1970s. He was tried and convicted for some crimes and led to believe that he was capable of anything. With his military background, he was certainly capable of pulling off a heist like Cooper's, but was he capable of murder? I think the short answer is yes, he was capable of murder. Career criminal, especially as someone who may have had a reason to murder his stepfather. And I've read in some other sources, which I'll talk about in a second, that the way that Philip Rackstraw was murdered appears to have been he was kneeling down in the backyard and shot in the back of the head. Now, somebody like Robert Rackstraw, who was set to inherit his property, I mean, yes, he does seem like a likely candidate for that, because people commit these types of murders all the time. I mean, that's how they end up on Forensic Files. That's how they end up on shows like 48 Hours, because they commit these types of murders for profit. And you've already heard about numerous other examples of Robert Rackstraw committing crimes for profit, such as check fraud, such as being some type of illegal pilot in Iran, or maybe even just being D.B. Cooper. But with his military background and being a helicopter pilot in the Army, and again, someone who would have been through a lot of intense training because of Vietnam, also explosives training, a lot of things do point to Robert Rackstraw. And I think that the biggest reasons why people doubt that he was D.B. Cooper are, number one, his age, only being 28 years old at the time. And I really just have to say it over and over again. When you look at the D.B. Cooper composite sketches, does that man look 28? I think he looks closer to 48 than 28. That's me. And also, I mean, was a simple fact of whereabouts, or just the simple fact of, did he actually do it? I mean, yes, he's a criminal, but did he actually commit that crime? Moreover, for this episode, did he actually commit the murder of Philip Rackstraw? But anyway, back to the Cinemaholic. The docuseries briefly goes into the part about his life, and here's what you should know. Did Robert Rackstraw kill his stepfather, Philip Rackstraw? Officially, no. While Robert Rackstraw was tried for the crime, he was acquitted of it. Now, here's one reason why I wanted to read off this particular article, and that is that Robert Rackstraw was on trial, and he was acquitted. And it says here, did he commit the crime? Officially, no. No, he was acquitted. You can say found not guilty. The jury didn't think so, or it wasn't proven to everybody's satisfaction. That does not mean for a second that he didn't do it. Officially, no. I mean, when you look at other high-profile court cases, O.J. Simpson, for example, he was found not guilty. It doesn't mean anything about whether he committed the murders or not. He was found not guilty. Casey Anthony is another one. She was found not guilty. It has nothing to do with her innocence or guilt. It's just not guilty. There were doubts, or they weren't able to prove to everyone's satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt that this person committed the crime. And if there is reasonable doubt, then they are supposed to acquit. So, back to the article. However, with Robert Rackstraw's criminal streak in the 1990s, a lot of people don't find it difficult to believe that he might have had involvement in murder. I don't either. I mean, if he's committing all these other crimes, it's also something that I've encountered while I've been running a true crime channel. Deviant behavior such as committing murder isn't always the first thing that people do. There are lots of people who start out as low-life criminal thugs. You can think of the serial killer that starts as a peeping Tom. Or how about serial killers who start by abusing animals, animal cruelty and such, and then their deviant behavior escalates to murder. And the same can be true about people who are going to commit murders for profit. It can start with other types of deviant behavior, stealing, or, for example, you might have a business person who is cheating and fudging the books a little bit. They're embezzling money, and then they commit a murder to acquire a larger amount of money. Criminal behavior can escalate in its severity. But I'll go back. Philip was Bob's mother's third husband. Okay, there, I got it. Again, a lot of these sentences are weird. She had died some time ago due to cancer, but the stepfather seemed to have a good relationship with the children. When Bob came to Valley Springs with a string of failed businesses on his resume, Philip decided to help him out. Together, they started a construction business in Valley Springs, and things seem to have been going well for them. Philip discovered that Bob was stealing from their clients. The Netflix documentary informs that Philip had a bag of receipts that he was taking to the accountant, but they disappeared on the same evening. And again, this stuff, this is some damning evidence. It's not like a smoking gun or being caught red-handed, but I would be horribly suspicious of some guy like Robert Rackstraw for the murder of his stepfather and business partner if he has a lot to gain from this murder. When Philip suddenly disappeared, his brother approached private investigator Jack Immendorf to look into it. When asked where his stepfather was, Bob said he had gone to Hawaii on vacation. However, the investigation revealed that Philip had certainly not gone anywhere. Suspecting that he was killed, Immendorf advised Philip's brother to look around the family plot for signs of a burial. Sure enough, they found Philip with a bullet in the back of his head. Bob was charged with the murder, but he was able to get the jury on his side on sympathetic terms. He arrived at the courthouse in a wheelchair, claiming injuries from the war. He listed down all the awards and recognitions from the Army, a lot of which were made up. He also got emotional about his stepfather, saying that he will find whoever did this to him. Now, this does sound a lot like O.J. Simpson minus the Vietnam military service. Everything he did that had the desired effect, and at the end of the day he was found not guilty. Despite the acquittal, Philip's sister maintained that she thought Bob had killed her brother. Bob's ex-wife, Linda Kunkel, also believes that he was fully capable of murdering his stepfather and not bothering to look back once. Despite their claims, the fact remains that it could not be proved that Bob had anything to do with Philip's death. And that's where I think there's something frustrating because, it might be frustrating when you're thinking about the high-profile true crime cases that get explored. Who was D.B. Cooper? Who was the Zodiac Killer? Who was Jack the Ripper? Of course, we want to know the answers to those things. But I'm even just sitting back and reading the stuff, just thinking, well, wait a second. Did Robert Rackstraw actually commit the murder of Philip Rackstraw? And my honest response is, I don't know. I think he had a solid motive to do so. Money, profit. Why do people commit crimes? Money, sex, and power. Or some combination of the two. With Robert Rackstraw, it also sounds like he just had an inclination and proclivity to commit these types of criminal behaviors because he thought that he would get away with them. We could bring in some more of these dark triad discussions about narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. Machiavellianism meaning that he thought that he was above the laws of society, so he didn't have to follow the rules of said society. He could just intertwine them, like he could weave his way around them, almost intertwining his own set of ideas into society and taking advantage of other people along the way. I know that's not the textbook definition of Machiavellianism, but it sounds like that's what Robert Rackstraw was doing, based on all these other crimes that he was committing. And I can kind of just ask you guys right now, what do you think about the Rackstraw murder so far? Are you leaning one way or another? I would love to read your ideas in the comment section down below. And also, if you're curious about some of the other stories that I mentioned, the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper, I do a segment every Monday about the Zodiac Killer and one every Wednesday about Jack the Ripper. And if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And this week on Black Box Online Radio, I will be doing a special weekend episode about the book The Sociopath Next Door by Dr. Martha Stout. It's going to be called The Sociopath Next Door True Crime Book Discussion. If you're curious about criminal psychology or just looking at a blend of conventional criminal psychology with just ideas that are pulled from YouTube and things that have been discussed here on Black Box Online Radio, relevant to serial killers, mass shooters, as well as perhaps criminals like Robert Rackstraw. I invite you to check that out. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88. And that allows you to make a donation or a contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And this discussion about the murder of Philip Rackstraw would not be complete without going over to Oxygen.com. Now, the Oxygen Network might be a media publication site and channel that people don't think too highly of a lot. And they have done one of the largest presentations on the murder of Philip Rackstraw for their series, Buried in the Backyard. And it's really just quite shocking how they're putting together these types of true crime series now. Even ones like that are featured on HLN, just the different ways that they explore things like Killer Newlyweds and such, and now Buried in the Backyard on Oxygen True Crime. And there's an article that was written by Joe Demowitz, and it says, California man found buried on his property was shot twice in the back of the head. Investigators searching for a missing widow get caught up with the federal hunt for the notorious D.B. Cooper skyjacker. And they're using the term widow, but I always grew up calling women widows and men widowers, but it seems like they've done away with that, so to speak. In February of 1978, law enforcement in Calaveras County made a grim discovery on the property of a man who'd vanished 6 months earlier. In a shallow grave, they found the body of 50-year-old Philip Rackstraw. It looked like he had been kneeling on one end of the hole and then fell over. Shannon Van Zandt, Calaveras County's archivist, told Buried in the Backyard, airing on Saturdays on Oxygen, and by this time, the missing persons case had taken a shocking twist and had overlapped with the infamous federal investigation involving D.B. Cooper. No one saw that coming. The search for Philip Rackstraw. In 1977, Philip Rackstraw ran a construction business in Valley Springs, and he faced a personal tragedy. When his wife Lucille died from cancer, the couple had a happy family. Lucille's children, Robert and Linda, even took Philip's last name. Well, I don't really know if they had a happy family. Their son was a career criminal. That depends on what your definition of happiness is. I really don't think that everything was all sunshine and roses if he's committing all these crimes. Robert worked with Philip at his construction company while Linda married and settled in Stockton, California with her family. Robert had a big support base that helped him get through a difficult time, said private investigator Jack Emmendorf. His neighbors Ben and Louise Brooks introduced Philip to her sister Marjorie. In 1977, Philip and Marjorie had planned a celebration to announce that they were dating, but Philip never showed up. Neighbors went to check on Philip at his farm. His dogs were there, and his car was there, but Philip, who was inexplicably departing, was totally out of character. Robert said that his stepdad was probably away on a job, but as days passed with no word from Philip, concern grew and Linda filed a missing persons report with the Valley Springs sheriff. Now this says away on a job, but as you heard in the article from the Cinemaholic, Robert said that he was in Hawaii at the time. Investigators learned from Ben Brooks that Philip was facing problems at his construction business. Philip said that money had gone missing. Robert gave a different account. He indicated to police that Philip had a gambling problem which was hurting the business. But as we've already heard, it's quite possible that Robert Rackstraw was stealing the money. And yes, of course, the case breakers are going to say that because he's their suspect. And the honest answer about the case breakers and perhaps the entirety of their presentation in the book, The Last Master Outlaw, is they're just going to say perhaps anything that would make their suspect look bad because it helps their D.B. Cooper theory. And this is just another criminal thing that D.B. Cooper has done. Yeah, he committed the skyjacking, took the $200,000, even though the bills didn't end up back in circulation to the best of our knowledge. But, I mean, he also needed money 7 years later, so he murdered his stepfather in their theory. In their theory, once again. Robert added that Philip could be on a drinking bender in Hawaii. It was unclear if Philip had gone missing or simply left his life in California. The sheriff's department's hands were tied. Private investigators take on Philip Rackstraw's case. In September, William Rackstraw, Philip's brother, hired a private investigator named Jack Emmendorf. In Hawaii, Emmendorf worked every connection that concluded that Philip Rackstraw simply wasn't there. Investigators looked into other scenarios, but confirming that Philip had not been arrested or jailed in an accident. But Philip's financial records proved most illuminating. There had been no bank account activity since July 26th. We knew that something was rotten in Denmark, said Emmendorf. Investigators believed that Philip met with foul play. But why? Had he made enemies because of his gambling and financial situation? Well, you would think that if he owed like money in a gambling debt, then they would have done something to make him produce the money as opposed to have just murdered him and buried his body in the backyard. That doesn't really solve their problem. Just saying. Detectives turned their attention to Robert's relationship with Philip. William told investigators that Philip thought Robert was stealing money and writing bad checks, said Michelle Sass, Philip's granddaughter. Bill Rackstraw told me that his missing brother had indicated that he was going to get things together and probably go to the authorities, said Emmendorf. And then all of a sudden, he disappeared. I just want to point out that you have multiple people sharing this stuff. Michelle Sass, the granddaughter, and Bill Rackstraw, the brother, are saying that Philip Rackstraw realized that somebody was stealing money from him, so he was going to go to the authorities. Robert Rackstraw becomes a suspect in his stepfather's disappearance. Robert became a person of interest, and investigators learned about his service in the military, where he flew helicopters. They found out that he had been dishonorably discharged. The Army realized that he had lied on his enlistment form, said Van Zandt. He, in fact, did not have a college degree. In addition, he also had domestic violence charges. As I said, Criminal behavior can escalate. It starts with domestic violence. It starts with lying on the resume. Then it starts to stealing. Would it ultimately go to something as extravagant as D.B. Cooper? With Robert Rackstraw, I wouldn't be enormously surprised. I would be enormously surprised if Rackstraw were indeed D.B. Cooper, because, again, I don't think he matches the physical descriptions. I think if he were D.B. Cooper, he would be more or less a dead ringer for everything. Not to mention, it's not only the physical appearance. Rackstraw was confronted multiple times near the end of his life about this. He was even offered $20,000 from Tom Colbert of the Case Breakers to admit that he was D.B. Cooper, and he didn't do it. He contemplated doing it, though, but someone's offering him $20,000. I mean, I might be tempted to take that money, and it really would depend on the consequences, knowing that he was at the end of his life. In November, private investigators discovered that Robert had leased Philip's house. The tenants had no idea that Philip was missing. Robert had told the renters to avoid an area of the property because it had dangerous wells. Now, this is also some things that just look really damning, and I don't think it's only the Case Breakers and Tom Colbert that are trying to make Robert Rackstraw look guilty of this. I think all of these media sources are trying to create the image of Robert Rackstraw being guilty of the murder of Philip Rackstraw, but, well, did he actually do it? I mean, they're trying to make it appear as if he were guilty, talking about these things. Okay, he was stealing money from the company, he rented the house, he told people to avoid a place in the backyard. They're trying to make it look like Rackstraw was guilty of his stepfather's murder. But at the same time, based on everything that I've heard so far, reasonable doubt. If I were sitting on a jury and you were just to share everything that you've heard so far, I would be like, I mean, I'm kind of thinking that he did it, but I have doubts. I mean, there are so many possible scenarios that could have taken place where Rackstraw didn't murder his stepfather. By the time it was clear that anything was wrong, and Philip wasn't coming back, Jack Emmendorf started, he was probably buried right there on the property. Oh, I think so too. I think so too that Philip Rackstraw would have been shot in the back of the head. And as you heard in that article from the Cinemaholic, it's almost as if he was kneeling over and he fell into the hole. I mean, I think that somebody lured him out there, and maybe they instructed him to kneel, maybe they didn't, but he was shot in the back of the head and the body was pushed into the hole rather shortly after he was murdered, maybe even immediately after he was murdered. On January 29th of 1978, the police went to Robert's home with a search warrant for clues to his whereabouts. They turned up guns and a stash of dynamite. The FBI joined the case. I found out for the first time, too, that the feds were looking at him, too, said Emmendorf. The reason was a possible connection to the only unsolved skyjacking in the history of the country. Rackstraw's linked to D.B. Cooper. The FBI believed that Robert Rackstraw might be the missing D.B. Cooper, who hijacked a commercial jet and got away with it in 1971. D.B. Cooper boarded a flight with explosives strapped to him and demanded $200,000, said Van Zandt. Well, that's getting a little bit muddy on the details. They landed, the passengers went off the plane, and the FBI gave them the $200,000. They refueled the plane, and the plane took off. Somewhere along the flight, D.B. Cooper jumped out of the back of the plane with the $200,000. His whereabouts remain unknown. Was Rackstraw D.B. Cooper? He could parachute, fly a helicopter, and was trained in explosives. Again, he's checking all of these prerequisites. Private investigator Gene Emmendorf said that he was a one-man wrecking crew. And in 1978, Robert was brought to the U.S. He was arrested for explosives charges and check fraud. At the same time, the body was recovered from the shallow grave in Calaveras County, and it was identified through dental records as Philip Rackstraw. He had been shot twice in the back of the head. The burial site was in the area where Robert had told the tenants to avoid. On March 2nd of 1978, Robert Rackstraw was charged with the murder of his stepfather. A lack of physical evidence made it a challenging case for prosecutors. The defense team portrayed Robert, who was using a wheelchair during the trial, as a disabled veteran. He was found not guilty. I really don't think that that would have been enough to simply show that he was not guilty of the crime. I think the reasons that Robert Rackstraw was found not guilty, I think that it was because of the lack of physical evidence. Now, if you had ballistics or something, if you're going to say that he was arrested and he was carrying the gun that matched the bullets that were used to kill Philip Rackstraw, then you have a more or less slam dunk case, even though there could still be doubts. I mean, if he were in possession of the murder weapon, or if a witness had last seen him walking with Philip Rackstraw, or he had told somebody that he was digging the hole, I mean, those would be stronger pieces of evidence. Still not 100% certifiable. But the whole point is that, based on everything that you've heard, I think that I would also have to say not guilty. I think that he did it, but I have so many doubts as to whether or not Robert Rackstraw actually committed that crime. I'm leaning toward the fact that he did, but I mean, to talk about things like maybe having a grudge with somebody else, other types of enemies, somebody else maybe wanted access to Philip Rackstraw's money. Maybe it wasn't Robert Rackstraw who was stealing from the company, it was somebody else. So many questions. And as I said, this is a very frustrating one because you think you know what happened. It's like, oh, well, clearly Rackstraw was guilty. Robert Rackstraw murdered his stepfather, and he just put on an act and got away with it. But at the same time, the hard evidence just isn't there. So that's my take on the subject, and I'll ask you one more time. Do you believe that Robert Rackstraw committed the murder of Philip Rackstraw in 1978? I would love to know your responses. Question number 2. Do you think that Robert Rackstraw was D.B. Cooper? I think that he had the brain for it, and I think that he had the brain to murder Philip Rackstraw, but there is just insufficient evidence in both examples. And definitely with D.B. Cooper, I mean, I just think that he is the wrong type of suspect. You know, somebody who, just because he has the knowledge about airplanes and aviation and explosives, doesn't mean that he was D.B. Cooper. There's only one D.B. Cooper out there. And as far as committing the murder of his stepfather, as you see, he has a direct connection to not only the family, but also the business. Multiple motives could exist. How about renting out his house, leasing the house without other people knowing? All of that stuff looks extremely guilty. Those types of connections to the D.B. Cooper case just are not there. But that's all for me now. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want. And please check out the bonus episode this weekend on the Sociopath Next Door. That's all for me now, and until next